Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and it is time once again for another product review. This time I'm taking a look at yet another entry in Goodman Games' Original Adventures Reincarnated line. Original Adventures Reincarnated number 4, The Lost City. It's a 5th edition conversion and expansion of the classic basic D&D module B4, The Lost City. For those who aren't familiar with the series, Original Adventures Reincarnated sees Goodman Games taking an adventure from the classic days of D&D and AD&D, providing background material and interviews with people of the era, one or more reprints of the original version, depending on how many prints there were, of course, and then a 5th edition conversion of the original, usually with expanded background material from later sources, as well as new areas where appropriate. This, of course, varies from offering to offering, since many of these adventures came from a time when the very concept of a role-playing game adventure was actually still evolving. At this point, reviewing the Original Adventures Reincarnated series is barely a surprise to me. So far, Goodman Games has done excellent work in reproducing, converting, and expanding the adventures that they've tried up to this point, all in a high-quality hardbound book. So the real question is whether this tradition continues with The Lost City, what extra material is provided, and the quality and the nature of the expansions to the setting. As always with these reviews, I'll go over the physical presentation briefly, and then do a quick run-through of the contents before giving my thoughts on it all at the end. Although I feel like this one will have more commentary about certain parts as they crop up than others in the Original Adventures Reincarnated series, just because of the way it is organized. Like prior entries into the series, The Lost City is a stitch-bound, ribbon-bookmarked 320-page hardback, with full color cover to evoke the look of the original module, with a mostly black and white interior. Whereas prior entries into the series did have some full color plates, in this offering it's limited merely to the color covers of the original module in the reprint section. So in a way, that's a little bit of a downgrade from previous entries in the series. However, I believe it is actually passable since the original module didn't actually have anything in the way of color art beyond the cover itself, so there likely wasn't much reason to have more than just that in this book. The binding seems to differ a little bit from prior entries in the series as well. While the quality does seem just as good, I'm going to move a Isle of Dread up for comparison. The quality does seem quite as good, but there are noticeable differences, especially with how the cover is put together. It's just a bit of a tighter, crisper format, I believe, and honestly, I don't see too much of a problem yet. I haven't really seen how long it will last, but at first glance it seems to be every bit as durable as the prior ones. In terms of interior format, the pages are the typical 2-column that has become pretty trope with modern role-playing games, with inline tables, text boxes, and the occasional illustration and or map, pretty typical for these offerings, save for the reprint of the original module. There is a neat scan of the original format, and it's a very clean presentation at that. It feels almost as if it were a proper first-generation print that was made directly for this book. New black and white artwork has been introduced to illustrate dungeon encounters here and there, and the new cartography is done in a style similar to the prior offering, Isle of Dread. Map errors have been corrected where necessary, especially since there were several in the original, and a summary of the errors has actually been provided in the original module reprint section for those who simply want to run the original module. The new cartography style kind of splits the difference between modern and old school styles, with a number of embellishments and illuminations scattered throughout them to make them more interesting to look at, but not necessarily battle map styled as you might see in a modern adventure. In terms of the contents, there are 8 chapters and 5 appendices. The chapters start with an introduction, with a background and an interview. Chapter 2 is a reprint of the original publication, with all of its contents virtually identical between printings, so only one copy is really offered, although there are 2 versions of the cover available because there were basically 2 major printings of the original module. Chapter 3 is where the 5th edition conversion starts, and a background of the new conversion is there, followed by a chapter each for the upper and lower pyramids, which basically constitutes the whole of the original adventure. Chapter 6 details the underground city of Synedicia, expanding the notations of the original adventure into proper write-ups of encounter areas complete with their own maps. The last two chapters, 7 and 8, expand the goblin caves and the lower catacombs mentioned in the original adventure into full-scale dungeons unto themselves. Appendix A deals with new magic items and spells, although many of these are not actually new, but rather old classic magic items and spells converted to 5th edition. Appendix B covers the new monster stats, while Appendix C offers stats for playable characters as well as major NPCs and villains. This concludes the non-monster generic NPCs that you can run across in the module. Appendix D offers handouts, which the original adventure only had a few of, but it has been expanded past the couple handouts in the original to include new artwork of a number of places of import in the adventure. Finally, there's Appendix E, where all of the various new maps are collected together for easy reference. So let's take a look at each section in detail. Chapter 1, the introduction, includes the usual background articles and scholarly matter that comes with these original Adventures Reincarnated series. It starts with an introduction by Chris Doyle, who headed the 5th edition conversion and writing, followed by a quick look at the module by Mike Merles. There's a look back at Tom Moldvay's work on the original Lost City module by James Malajewski, which unfortunately Tom Moldvay actually passed back in 2007, so of course they can't actually provide anything from him. This is followed by an interview with Harold Johnson, who was with TSR from 1979 all the way through its acquisition by Wizards of the Coast and beyond, eventually leaving in 1999. It's an interesting read, all in all, but it seems a little bit more fillery than some of the past interviews from the original Adventures Reincarnated series. It's extremely interesting if you like to know more about the inner workings of TSR's business and operations back then, less so if you're more interested in creative processes or the history of the module in general. Chapter 2 covers the original module's reprints. It has a list of the various map and text errors that never got corrected, so you can use this with the original version with less effort if you wish. If you're not familiar with the original module, The Lost City, it is sort of a survival dungeon crawl adventure that left a lot of room for expansion. The characters find themselves lost in a desert only to find shelter in a pyramid poking up amongst the sand-covered ruins of an ancient city. Inside, they encounter various factions, the Synedicians, a civilization that has collapsed under its own decay and influence of a monstrous god named Zargon. A departure from the classic kick-in-the-door-and-slaughter-everything style of doing things that was common at the time, it rewarded characters who took the opportunity to work with the degenerate remnants of the once great city of Synedicia, and although the destruction of the alien abomination Zargon was possible, it was not necessarily required or even the end goal. Instead, the characters were meant to focus more on survival and accumulating resources to brave the trek back to civilization, at least at first, and perhaps to acquire a fair amount of treasure before doing so. The module was designed in a series of sections meant to gradually relinquish development of the setting to the individual DM. The tiers of the upper pyramid were described in detail and fully fleshed out in the format of the time, fully stocked and realized, allowing for a classic dungeon crawling exploration and allowing you to start immediately. The lower tiers of the pyramid, under the sand, were stocked but not necessarily fully detailed. One could run them as is or add room descriptions and events where necessary. The final section of the module, the actual underground city of Synedicia, was mapped, but only a framework of ideas were given for what might be where in the city, and it was up to the DM to fully map out or develop any areas the PCs went to. There were also a large number of further quests offered to allow for an adventure to expand in an entire campaign once the characters reached the lower city. This approach was not only different from most prior offerings in the B series at the time, but offered the ability to expand a simple dungeon crawl adventure into a full campaign, in much the same way that the Isle of Dread from the X series did. Oddly enough, also a Moldvay credit, that one with David Cook, of course. The original adventure was inspired by classic tales of sword and sorcery rather than high fantasy, and was much more meant to hearken to something like Conan rather than The Lord of the Rings. Another point of interest was that, at least in the detailed rooms, there is more of a reliance on humans, or at least mostly humans, in the form of the Synedicians themselves, as well as animals, rather than the standard humanoids that would populate such a module on a normal basis. Oh yes, there were certainly humanoids in the form of goblins and hobgoblins scattered here and there, as well as similar monsters, but they didn't take the central role that most encounters would do in another type of adventure. It made for a very different feel of things, I have found, at least in adventures that I have run. Players have a slightly different way of approaching encounters with other humans rather than with monstrous humanoids such as orcs and goblins, and this is actually reflected in the original module. The original module also had a couple other items of note. First is a bit of a glossary, which defined terms that you might not expect a kid to necessarily know. Not RPG terms, mind you, but architectural and furnishing terms, which can be quite useful for a younger group of players. There was also a set of standard equipment packs for quick adventure creation, as well as a sort of distant precursor to the equipment package character creation system so common in modern RPGs. Chapter 3 is where the 5th edition conversion really starts. It covers the adventure background, including a basic rewrite of the Dungeon Master notes of the city of the original module. Now, in prior original Adventures Reincarnated offerings, expanded material was largely kept separate, and that's the case for much of it in the Lost City. However, some expanded material has been threaded throughout the conversion, most notably in the background section here. This expanded material is not just new additions, but also new material taken from a 3rd edition D&D era material, as well as a original D&D era gazetteer that kind of expanded on the lore of the Lost City. This includes a new storyline and setting information added by Wizards of the Coast, and, well, let's just say that I have some strong thoughts on that, which I'll get into, especially the 3rd edition era legacy stuff. At any rate, the new background has a list of suggested character levels for each portion of the adventure, useful for 5th edition series parties, a rewritten history of the fall of Synodicia, including the expanded 3rd edition era material, expanded background on the Synodicians themselves, including the 4 main factions, the Brotherhood of Gorm, the Magi of Usamigaras, the Warrior Maidens of Medaris, and the Priests of Zargon. There's a little bit of information about wandering encounters in the desert, which expands the original adventure, which simply presumed that you just showed up at the pyramid and started you off at the front door. The encounters described outside are all very thematic for a lost city in the desert, and fairly well varied, including some more mysterious offerings. The chapter closes out with some tips on designing challenging encounters, a series of adventure hooks, the recommended player background, that's honestly just a rehash of the original adventure module start, and then a slightly expanded version of the glossary of useful terms, which was in the back of the original adventure. Chapter 4 is the 5th edition conversion of the Upper Pyramid, which was one part of the original module that was fairly well fleshed out and described. The format here, as is common throughout the rest of the book, has each room described with a number and a title, which necessarily has a read aloud text in italics, so you know what to look at, or at least what to read to your players. And then there's more in-depth explanations of what exactly happens in the room for, stuff that's only evident to the DM or after things occur. Monsters encountered are bolded for easy reference, and a number of rooms have a development subsection that gives details on how events may affect other rooms or linger with the party or just provide ongoing effects. Overall, the upper levels are presented here largely the same as they were originally, except that the 5th edition versions of hazards and monsters were used where appropriate, and a few traps have been scaled to be more in line with 5th edition trap threat levels, which means that they're still dangerous, but slightly less dangerous, and less likely to be career-ending. Except for a few which are actually exactly the same as they were in the first module, which is just hilarious when those do go off. I will say that there's not much added in this section, although the factions have been a little bit more fleshed out. Certain errors in the original text and maps have been corrected as well. Chapter 5 is the Lower Pyramid section, and this is the section where the original module was stocked but not necessarily described in detail, excepting, of course, where Zargon actually lairs. In this conversion, the rooms retain the same monsters for the most part, stocked as it was in the original module, but rooms have been thoroughly described and given a proper theme. The lower levels are, in fact, given a sort of storyline themselves, being a representation of the afterlife of the original Synedicians. Additionally, some rooms have events that were suggested but not fully detailed in the original module, and basically they've been more rounded out to make them seem on par with the rooms in the first upper levels. There are a few instances of changes in this area. For instance, an encounter listed that was just 3 blink dogs has become a room where you can actually find a figurine of wondrous power with 3 blink dogs in it instead of just another encounter. A few other minor changes like this are sprinkled throughout. Otherwise, it looks like it's basically the same format as in the prior chapter, with pretty much a progression of the same sorts of challenges that you would see up to the final fight with Zargon. Chapter 6 covers more of the lost city of Synedicia itself, a subterranean city with a cavern below the pyramid. The original module had an overall map of the city, then keyed areas within the city that had a line or two of text with the intent of the DM expanding on them according to their own wishes. In the original Adventures Reincarnated version, there is a more thorough description of each of the features of the city, although they remain the same, and they have been stocked and fully described with creatures based on what was described in the original module. A few of these areas even become minor dungeons in their own right, with 2 of the larger areas set aside in the following chapters. Each of the factions actually has its own headquarters, in which you can use a sort of mini dungeon-style setup for members of opposing factions, or as a place to rest and recover for those who are members of those factions. The 3-player joinable factions further have their own trial areas as well, where characters can prove themselves in the eyes of their faction. Overall, these areas are actually pretty well written and preserve a lot of the feel of the original module. The faction areas especially are interesting in the way they're laid out, with the various trials really seeming to reflect what that faction seems to value, be it combat encounters or challenging puzzles or riddles. Even the Eye of Zargon is appropriately fleshed out to provide a sort of semi-capstone to the campaign for those who actually wish to destroy Zargon for good. Some of the mini-dungeons provide a break from the overall theme of the adventure at large, including a giant ant nest and something called the Verdant Prison. Of note is that some of these areas have been given ties to the alternate quest routes detailed in the original module, which have been expanded here in the Further Adventures section at the end of this chapter. Chapter 7 covers the Goblin Caves, one of the sections given a brief mention in the original module's Lost City area, but now expanded into a multi-level goblin and humanoid-focused dungeon. The goblins are assumed to function as the main muscle of the Cult of Zargon in this version of the adventure, so clearing them out may interest a party looking to reduce Zargon's influence overall. There's some interesting mechanics, including what can essentially be fireman poles connecting different levels of the caves. The challenge rating is preserved since these goblin caves are pretty deep into the adventure. It's preserved through the use of both large numbers of goblins and interesting tactics being used. A few classic monsters start appearing here and there, which were never mentioned in the original module as well. I will say, however, that the pole room with its strangely pole-dancing goblins that were supposed to be practicing pole climbing and not pole dancing shall forever be seared into my mind. Chapter 8 covers the Lower Catacombs, meant to be one of the more challenging areas of the module. This includes a series of linked caves that gives home to some deep gnomes, but also introduces some various threats in a fungal cavern, as well as a smattering of miscellaneous encounters. There is a brown dragon's lair, which offers your requisite dragon for a Dungeons & Dragons game, but also offers a potential exit back to the surface, as well as a decently represented, non-standard dragon color. Finally, there's an entirely new villain that's said to be an ally of Zargon, a mind flayer named Cephalocor. Creative, right? They're also responsible for the poisoning of the Synedicians with a sort of dream potion, which kind of changes the entire tone of the adventure from the original, but again, I'll get back to that in a bit. And that honestly concludes the bulk of this adventure. There is, the rest of the contents. They're basically the appendices. Appendix A covers various magical items and spells, including some classic cursed items such as the Helm of Opposite Alignment and the Ring of Weakness. The spells are likewise a mix of classic and one-off spells. The classics include such things as Hold, Portal, and Snake Charm, but there's a few unique spells in there that didn't appear in either the old system or the original module that seem to be placed there either to fill out certain spellbooks or to provide a means for certain NPCs to perform actions not necessarily explainable otherwise. Appendix B is a collection of new monsters, which is actually a collection of some new, but a lot of classic monsters from the era, such as the Bone Golem, the Caryatid Column, the various Darklings types, and two of my personal favorite lycanthropes, the Devil Swine and the Werefox. There are a few completely new creatures that just aren't rehashes from old editions, and a number of creatures that are conversions of old creatures but that didn't actually appear in the original module. And because 5th edition is 5th edition, of course, there's actually a lot of variations on bugs and various humanoids that are designed to just fill roles in a mixed group. All in all, there's, a lot of creatures here, like in many of the other original Adventures Reincarnated offerings. Appendix C starts with pre-generated characters for use as player characters, although due to the increased complexity of 5th edition characters, these actually take up a larger table. The individual NPCs and named creatures follow, as well as specific types of Synedicians that you might encounter wandering around. Again, some variations of generic Synedician NPCs are there to fill particular roles in an encountered group. There's also a list of general Synedician encounters that is taken from the original module to highlight the weirdness of these adult people. Appendix D is the handout section, and includes a number of illustrations useful to show details of certain things encountered in the dungeon. And finally, Appendix E is, of course, the map section. This has all of the old maps gathered, as well as the new ones. This includes not only the new versions of the old maps, but, new versions for new areas and such. Again, I rather like the art style as presented, which is far more illustrated than your usual OSR fare while keeping to that same general style. There is, however, a stark difference between the maps of the new areas and those of the older areas, with the older areas having a sort of design that was useful at the time with big blocky spaces between walls and blocky lined out corridors, while the maps of the newer areas have a more naturalistic style. It does present a bit of a stylistic break overall, although not one that is necessarily going to wreck the game, and is certainly very understandable. So, how does Original Adventures Reincarnated: The Lost City stack up? Well, physically, it's of a similar quality to the prior offerings in the series, which is to say, excellent. It seems like a book that will last a fair while and sustain use at the tabletop, which is honestly more than one can say for a lot of RPG books nowadays. For the background and scholarly material that comes with the Original Adventures Reincarnated series, this one seems to be the weakest so far in that regard, and that's honestly to be expected, since as time goes on and more of these are released, the same ground really can't be retrod without sounding repetitive. You really don't want to get the same people over and over again, and honestly, as time marches on, there's less of the original people left. I appreciate that they're still doing it, but it doesn't have the impact of the articles from, say, Into the Borderlands or the Isle of Dread offering. The new artwork is solid, just black and white illustrations in a style that Goodman Games does well with an old school feel without feeling actually retro, which is a difficult line to walk. I do enjoy having handouts to show points of interest in a dungeon, and that's something the original B4 lacked. I did note the stylistic differences between the old maps and the new material maps, which is evident even when comparing the new maps on both ends, but as I said, it's nothing really that breaks the feel of things. The conversion of the old material is rock solid, and it's really good to see some classic spells and monsters resurfacing again. Even the fleshed out versions of the previously only stocked lower tiers of the pyramid are well done, and really go a long way towards completing the feel of the setting. These sections maintain the original feel of the modules fairly well. About the only point I will note is that with all of these Original Adventures Reincarnated books, there are a number of old monsters that have reappeared again and again, so if you own a lot of them, you may actually have 5th edition conversions of old monsters in them, and with more stuff that's official coming out, you may already have new versions of old monsters anyway. The new material overall, that's where I've got some issues. And it's nothing that Goodman Games did, actually. The new areas, which are expansions of the underground city that were simply given 1 or 2 line entries in the original module, they're well written, they're well designed, and they seem to fit in as well as they can be with the existing material, but they make use of some of the ideas introduced in the material added to the Lost City well after the fact, let's say in the 3rd edition Dragon magazine column. And the creation of a new Mind Flayer enemy to serve as an ally/rival to Zargon challenges the overall feel of the adventure in a subtle but important way. The original module was a model of Howardian swords and sorcery, with an exotic locale inhabited by people falling into degeneracy. The ancient horror of Zargon was a weird and unpredictable element that had been present in the setting for generations, and the decline and fracturing of the Synodician society, although triggered by the arrival of Zargon, was mostly fueled by their own internal degeneracy. For all of its simplicity, the original module followed themes of the slide into barbarism, the fracturing of a civilization as internal threats rose to the fore, and the gradual decline into madness of an entire people who sought escape into a drug-filled dream world under their own volition, or at least under the command of their deluded priests who had taken to serving Zargon. This is a decay that has taken generations, enough that the people of Synodecia have begun to physically adapt to their new underground lifestyle. In the new material, however, the Synodicians are being poisoned by an outside source. Their decline is no longer the result of internal feuding, but rather due to an external influence that's seeking to exacerbate that. Their dream state is being inflicted upon them by a scheming villain rather by their own failings. The cult of Zargon, which, although it was relatively weak within the pyramid itself, was said to be strong enough to control the underground city in the original module, it's now stated to rely mostly on humanoids that do most of their enforcement for them, changing the focus of villains from the nearly human to the monstrous. Furthermore, the use of a Mind Flayer as the origin of the Dream State elixir can lead to certain inconsistencies within the overall plot timeline. This all has the effect of shifting the fundamental feel of the adventure to something a little bit different. Something more typical of generic heroic fantasy adventuring rather than a sword and sorcery kind of setting. And most of that new material is based on additions that came after the original module was released, but before Goodman Games really got a crack at it, so I can't really blame Goodman Games for the faults in that. It leaves me torn. The additions, at least mechanically, are decent, well put together, and will undoubtedly serve well for anyone running the Lost City as an extended campaign. I just personally preferred the feel of the original module, the thematic elements it set forth, and overall the almost more nihilistic stylings that it inherits from the sword and sorcery genre. I will undoubtedly run parts of this adventure in the coming months and years, and I appreciate the 5th edition conversion, I really do, but I'll likely be making my own changes regarding the expanded material to bring the tone closer to the original module. For those that aren't as invested in that Howardian style, though, presented as is, the adventure is just fine. It's just fine, and it will fit in with the rest of the original Adventures Reincarnated series with no problem. And you might even prefer the more heroic, kill the monstrous enemy stylings of this particular version. Now, supposedly, the next couple of releases are going to be Castle Amber and the Temple of Elemental Evil, both very solid choices that I look forward to. In fact, I'm more interested and more excited about the Goodman Games offerings than I am about the mainstream WotC offerings anymore. So I can only hope to see them continue to go through this and continue to improve their products. Anyway, on that note, I'm going to wrap this up here. This has been the RPG Crawler with my review of Original Adventures Reincarnated, The Lost City. As always, I will put a link to where you can pick it up in the description below. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you've got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. Until next time, take care and goodbye.